A Journey to the Center of the Earth, by Jules Verne, Chapter 2. A mystery to be solved at any price. That study of his was a museum, and nothing else. Specimens of everything known in mineralogy lay there in their places in perfect order, and correctly named, divided into inflammable, metallic, and lithoid minerals. How well I knew all these bits of science! Many a time, instead of enjoying the company of lads of my own age, I had preferred dusting these graphites, anthracites, coals, lignites, and peats. And there were bitumens, resins, organic salts, to be protected from the least grain of dust, and metals, from iron to gold, metals whose current value altogether disappeared in the presence of the Republican equality of scientific specimens, and stones too, enough to rebuild entirely the house in Königstrasse, even with a handsome additional room, which would have suited me admirably. But on entering this study now I thought of none of all these wonders. My uncle alone filled my thoughts. He had thrown himself into a velvet easy-chair, and was grasping between his hands a book over which he bent, pondering with intense admiration. "Here's a remarkable book. What a wonderful book!" he was exclaiming. These ejaculations brought to my mind the fact that my uncle was liable to occasional fits of bibliomania, but no old book had any value in his eyes unless it had the virtue of being nowhere else to be found, or, at any rate, of being illegible. "Well, now, don't you see it yet? Why, I have got a priceless treasure, that I found this morning, in rummaging in old Hevelius's shop, the Jew." "Magnificent," I replied, with a good imitation of enthusiasm. What was the good of all this fuss about an old quarto, bound in rough calf, a yellow, faded volume, with a ragged seal depending from it? But for all that there was no lull yet in the admiring exclamations of the professor. "See," he went on, both asking the questions and supplying the answers. "Isn't it a beauty? Yes. Splendid. Did you ever see such a binding? Doesn't the book open easily? Yes. It stops open anywhere. But does it shut equally well? Yes. For the binding and the leaves are flush, all in a straight line, and no gaps or openings anywhere. And look at its back, after 700 years. Why, Bozerian, Kloss, or Purgolf might have been proud of such a binding." While rapidly making these comments, my uncle kept opening and shutting the old tome. I really could do no less than ask a question about its contents, although I did not feel the slightest interest. "And what is the title of this marvelous work?" I asked with an affected eagerness which he must have been very blind not to see through. "This work," replied my uncle, firing up with renewed enthusiasm, "this work is the Heimskringla of Snorre, the most famous Icelandic author of the 12th century. It is the chronicle of the Norwegian princes who ruled in Iceland." "Indeed," I cried, keeping up wonderfully, "of course it is a German translation." "What?" sharply replied the professor, "a translation? What should I do with a translation? This is the Icelandic original, in the magnificent idiomatic vernacular, which is both rich and simple, and admits of an infinite variety of grammatical combinations and verbal modifications." "Like German," I happily ventured. "Yes," replied my uncle, shrugging his shoulders, "but, in addition to all this, the Icelandic has 3 numbers like the Greek, and irregular declensions of nouns proper like the Latin." "Ah," said I, a little moved out of my indifference, "and is the type good?" "Type? What do you mean by talking of type, wretched Axel? Type? Do you take it for a printed book, you ignorant fool? It is a manuscript, a runic manuscript." "Runic? Yes. Do you want me to explain what that is?" "Of course not," I replied in the tone of an injured man. But my uncle persevered, and told me, against my will, of many things I cared nothing about. Runic characters were in use in Iceland in former ages. They were invented, it is said, by Odin himself. Look there, and wonder, impious young man, and admire these letters, the invention of the Scandinavian god. Well, not knowing what to say, I was going to prostrate myself before this wonderful book, a way of answering equally pleasing to gods and kings, and which has the advantage of never giving them any embarrassment, when a little incident happened to divert conversation into another channel. This was the appearance of a dirty slip of parchment, which slipped out of the volume and fell upon the floor. My uncle pounced upon this shred with incredible avidity. An old document, enclosed in immemorial time within the folds of this old book, had for him an immeasurable value. "What's this?" He cried, and he laid out upon the table a piece of parchment, 5 inches by 3, and along which were traced certain mysterious characters. Here is the exact facsimile. I think it important to let these strange signs be publicly known, for they were the means of drawing on Professor Lidenbrock and his nephew to undertake the most wonderful expedition of the 19th century. Runic glyphs occur here. The professor mused a few moments over this series of characters, then raising his spectacles he pronounced, "These are runic letters. They're exactly like those of the manuscript of Snorr-Tellerson. But what on earth is their meaning? Runic letters appearing to my mind to be an invention of the learned to mystify this poor world. I was not sorry to see my uncle suffering the pangs of mystification. At least, so it seemed to me, judging from his fingers, which were beginning to work with terrible energy. It is certainly old Icelandic," he muttered between his teeth, and Professor Lidenbrock must have known, for he was acknowledged to be quite a polyglot. Not that he could speak fluently in the 2,000 languages and 12,000 dialects which are spoken on the earth, but he knew at least his share of them. So he was going, in the presence of this difficulty, to give way to all the impetuosity of his character, and I was preparing for a violent outbreak, when 2 o'clock struck by the little timepiece over the fireplace. At that moment our good housekeeper Martha opened the study door, saying, "Dinner is ready." I am afraid he sent that soup to where it would boil away to nothing, and Martha took to her heels for safety. I followed her, and hardly knowing how I got there I found myself seated in my usual place. I waited a few minutes. No professor came. Never within my remembrance had he missed the important ceremonial of dinner. And yet what a good dinner it was. There was parsley soup, an omelette of ham garnished with spiced sorrel, a fillet of veal with compote of prunes, for dessert, crystallized fruit, the whole washed down with sweet moselle. All this my uncle was going to sacrifice to a bit of old parchment. As an affectionate and attentive nephew I considered it my duty to eat for him as well as for myself, which I did conscientiously. "I have never known such a thing," said Martha. Lidenbrock is not at table. Who could have believed it? I said, with my mouth full. "Something serious is going to happen," said the servant, shaking her head. My opinion was that nothing more serious would happen than an awful scene when my uncle should have discovered that his dinner was devoured. I had come to the last of the fruit when a very loud voice tore me away from the pleasures of my dessert. With one spring I bounded out of the dining room into the study.